Disclaimer. Welcome to Stellar Narratives. What you're about to listen to is an exploration, not a conclusion. We're going to examine one of humanity's oldest and most widespread beliefs, reincarnation. We'll look at the evidence, the arguments, the mysteries, and the skepticism. This isn't about proving anyone right or wrong. Whether you're religious, spiritual, agnostic, or atheist, there's something here for you. We're not here to change your beliefs. We're here to present information so you can think critically and decide for yourself. The cases we discuss are real and documented. The perspectives we share come from diverse traditions and research. But ultimately, what you believe is entirely up to you. We welcome respectful discussions in the comments, and we honor the deeply personal nature of faith, spirituality, and worldview. Let's explore this together with curiosity, respect, and open minds. Reincarnation, fact or fiction? May 1st, 2000. A 4-year-old boy named James Leininger woke up screaming. Not unusual for a child his age, except for what he was screaming about. "My plane is on fire! I can't get out!" His parents, Bruce and Andrea, tried to calm him. Just a nightmare, they assured him. But the nightmares didn't stop. Night after night, the same terror, the same burning plane, the same desperate struggle to escape. And then, James started remembering things, impossible things. He told his parents the name of his aircraft carrier, the Natoma. He described his squadron. He drew pictures of planes with specific markings. He remembered the names of men who flew with him, men who died decades before James was born. He even remembered his own death. "I was shot down at Iwo Jima," the 4-year-old said. "My plane was hit by Japanese fire. I couldn't get out." When his parents finally investigated, desperate to explain their son's night terrors, they discovered something that would change their lives forever. Every single detail James had described was true. There had been a pilot. His name was James Houston Jr. He flew from the USS Natoma Bay. He was shot down at Iwo Jima on March 3rd, 1945. His plane took heavy fire and crashed into the Pacific Ocean. James Leininger knew all of this at age 4, before he could even read. How? This is the question that has haunted humanity across millennia, across continents, across every civilization that has ever gazed at the stars and wondered, where do we go when we die? And more mysteriously, where were we before we were born? For billions of people, the answer is reincarnation, the belief that consciousness, the essence of who you are, survives death and returns in a new form. But is it true? Or is it one of humanity's most beautiful delusions? Over the next 90 minutes, we're going to examine this question the way a detective examines evidence. We'll look at the most compelling cases, the strongest arguments, the phenomenon that believers say proves reincarnation is real. And we'll do it fairly, neither dismissing the claims nor accepting them blindly. Because whether you're a skeptic or a believer, the evidence demands your attention. Let's begin. Before we dive into the evidence, we need to be clear about what we're actually discussing. Because reincarnation doesn't mean the same thing to everyone. The word comes from Latin, re, meaning again, and carn, meaning flesh, to be in flesh again. But the concept itself is far older than Latin, stretching back at least 5,000 years to the ancient Vedic texts of India. At its core, Reincarnation is the belief that when you die, your consciousness, your soul, your essential self, doesn't disappear. Instead, it transfers to a new body. You are reborn. You live again. But here's where it gets complex. Different traditions have very different ideas about how this works. In Hinduism and Buddhism, reincarnation is intimately tied to the concept of karma, the idea that your actions in this life determine your next life. Do good, accumulate positive karma, and you might be reborn in favorable circumstances. Do harm, and your next life might be considerably less pleasant. You might not even come back as human. The ancient texts describe souls being reborn as animals, insects, even plants, depending on the severity of their karma. This creates a vast cycle called samsara, the wheel of birth, death, and rebirth. And for Hindus and Buddhists, the ultimate goal isn't to keep reincarnating, it's to escape the cycle entirely, to achieve moksha or nirvana, liberation from the endless wheel of suffering and rebirth. Now contrast that with other beliefs about reincarnation that don't involve karma at all. Some modern Western reincarnation believers think souls choose their next life, not as punishment or reward, but as a learning experience. Others believe reincarnation is automatic and random, with no moral component whatsoever. And then there are the beliefs that sound similar, but are actually quite different. Resurrection, central to Christianity and Islam, is not reincarnation. Resurrection means your same body will be restored to life, not that your soul will inhabit a different body. Rebirth, a subtle but important distinction in some Buddhist traditions, suggests that it's not a permanent soul that continues, but rather a stream of consciousness, more like a flame passing from one candle to another. The flame continues, but is it the same flame? These distinctions matter, because when we talk about evidence for reincarnation, we need to be clear. Evidence for what, exactly? Are we talking about karma-driven rebirth, soul migration, consciousness continuation? For the purposes of this investigation, we're focusing on the most common claim, that individual consciousness, the sense of I that makes you uniquely you, can survive death and manifest in a new body, sometimes retaining memories or characteristics from the previous life. That's the claim we're testing. Now, let's look at who believes it. Reincarnation isn't some fringe belief held by a handful of mystics. It's one of the most widely held spiritual concepts in human history. Today, roughly 1.2 billion people, nearly 1/6 of the global population, live in countries where reincarnation is a central religious doctrine. That includes most of India, Nepal, Tibet, Thailand, Sri Lanka, and much of Southeast Asia. But the belief extends far beyond these regions. Surveys show that about 24% of Americans believe in reincarnation, despite living in a predominantly Christian culture. In Europe, the numbers are similar. Roughly 1 in 5 people express belief in some form of rebirth. So where did this idea come from? And why is it so persistent? Let's start with the oldest documented traditions. Hinduism. The earliest written references to reincarnation appear in the ancient Vedic texts of India, dating back to around 1500 BCE. But the concept likely predates even these texts. In Hindu philosophy, the soul, called the Atman, is eternal and indestructible. When the physical body dies, the Atman doesn't perish. It simply sheds the old body like a snake sheds its skin and takes on a new one. The Bhagavad Gita, one of Hinduism's most sacred texts, puts it beautifully. Just as a person casts off worn-out garments and puts on new ones, so too the embodied soul casts off worn-out bodies and enters new ones. This isn't metaphor. For Hindus, this is literal truth. The soul migrates through countless lifetimes, accumulating karma until it finally achieves moksha, liberation from the cycle. Buddhism, which emerged from Hindu traditions around the 6th century BCE, adopted reincarnation but modified it in fascinating ways. The Buddha taught that there is no permanent, unchanging soul. Instead, what continues is a stream of consciousness, constantly changing, constantly in flux. It's not that you are reborn, but rather that your consciousness, shaped by karma, conditions the arising of a new being. This might sound like a subtle philosophical distinction, but it has profound implications. In Buddhism, there's nothing permanent to cling to. Even your sense of self is temporary. What continues is more like the pattern of a flame than a solid, unchanging entity. Yet Buddhists absolutely believe in rebirth. In fact, the entire Buddhist path is predicated on escaping the suffering of endless rebirth through enlightenment, nirvana. Jainism, another ancient Indian religion, takes reincarnation perhaps even more seriously than Hinduism or Buddhism. Jains believe that every living being, every animal, every insect, even plants and microorganisms, has a soul that is reincarnating. This is why many Jains practice extreme nonviolence, wearing masks to avoid accidentally inhaling insects, and sweeping the path before them to avoid stepping on any living creature. For Jains, the goal is to purify the soul through extreme asceticism and nonviolence until it achieves liberation. Sikhism, founded in the 15th century in Punjab, also accepts reincarnation, but with a twist. Sikhs believe that the soul goes through 8.4 million life forms before finally earning the privilege of human birth. Human birth is precious, Sikhs teach, because it's only as a human that you can break the cycle of reincarnation by merging with God. Now, you might notice something. All these religions originated in the Indian subcontinent. Is reincarnation just an Eastern belief? Not quite. Ancient Greece. The Greek philosopher Pythagoras, yes, the triangle guy, was a passionate believer in reincarnation around 570 BCE. He claimed to remember 4 of his past lives. Plato, arguably the most influential Western philosopher in history, wrote extensively about reincarnation. In his work, The Republic, he describes the soul choosing its next life, complete with warnings about the dangers of choosing poorly. The Orphic mysteries and other Greek mystery religions also taught reincarnation, believing the soul was divine, but trapped in the physical body as a form of punishment or purification. Ancient Egypt. Some scholars argue that certain Egyptian beliefs hinted at reincarnation, though this is debated. The Egyptians definitely believed in an afterlife, but whether they believed in returning to Earth in a new body is unclear from the surviving texts. Celtic and Druidic traditions. Julius Caesar, in his accounts of conquering Gaul, noted that the Druids believed firmly in reincarnation. He wrote that this belief made Celtic warriors fearless in battle. Why fear death if you're just going to come back? Indigenous traditions. Many indigenous cultures around the world have beliefs about reincarnation or soul continuation, though they often differ significantly from the Hindu-Buddhist model. The Inuit, for example, have a tradition of naming children after deceased relatives, believing the ancestor's soul returns in the child. Many African tribes have similar beliefs about ancestors returning in newborns, especially if the child bears a resemblance or birthmark matching the deceased. Native American tribes vary widely, but many have beliefs about souls returning, often within the same family lineage. So reincarnation in various forms appears across human cultures and throughout human history. But there's one major world religion that explicitly rejects it: Christianity. For most of Christian history, reincarnation has been considered incompatible with core Christian doctrine. Why? Because Christianity teaches that humans have one life, one death, and then judgment. As the book of Hebrews states, it is appointed for man to die once, and after that comes judgment. Christianity is built on the concept of resurrection, not reincarnation. Jesus didn't reincarnate, he resurrected in the same body. Christians believe that all humans will eventually be resurrected in glorified bodies, not reborn in different ones. Moreover, the Christian doctrine of salvation through faith in Christ doesn't work with reincarnation. If you have multiple lives to work out your salvation, the urgency of Christ's sacrifice loses its meaning. That said, here's where it gets controversial. Some researchers argue that early Christianity might have included reincarnation beliefs. They point to certain passages in the New Testament that could be interpreted as references to reincarnation, such as the disciples asking Jesus if a man was born blind because of his own sin, which would imply a previous life, or Jesus saying that John the Baptist was the prophet Elijah returned. And there's a more explosive claim that belief in reincarnation was deliberately suppressed by the early church. In 553 CE, the Second Council of Constantinople allegedly condemned the pre-existence of souls, which some interpret as an indirect rejection of reincarnation. Some claim this was a political decision, not a theological one, that early Christians did believe in reincarnation, but the doctrine was stamped out by church authorities who found it inconvenient. Is this true? Historians are divided. Mainstream scholarship generally says no. Early Christianity was always opposed to reincarnation. But alternative historians point to Gnostic texts and early church writings that they say prove otherwise. We'll leave that debate for historians. What matters for our investigation is this: whether or not early Christians believed in reincarnation, mainstream Christianity today does not. Islam. Islam also firmly rejects reincarnation. The Quran is explicit. Humans live once, die, face judgment, and go to either paradise or hell. Some Sufi mystics have explored concepts that sound vaguely like reincarnation, but these are not mainstream Islamic beliefs and are often viewed as heretical. Judaism. Traditional Judaism does not teach reincarnation. The Hebrew Bible makes no mention of it, and the focus is on living righteously in this life and being remembered by future generations. However, there's an interesting exception. Kabbalah, the mystical Jewish tradition, does include a doctrine called Gilgul, the idea that souls can be reincarnated to fulfill unfinished tasks or correct past mistakes. This belief isn't universal in Judaism, but it shows up in mystical texts and has some adherents, particularly in Hasidic communities. So what do we make of all this? Reincarnation is clearly not a universal belief, but it's far from rare. Billions of people structure their entire lives around the assumption that this is not their only existence. But belief, no matter how widespread, is not the same as evidence. So, now, let's turn to the evidence. If reincarnation is real, there should be evidence. Verifiable, documented, testable evidence. And according to some researchers, that evidence exists. It comes in the form of children, very young children, children who claim to remember past lives, children who describe people, places, and events they couldn't possibly know about, children who, when investigated, turn out to be disturbingly accurate. The most extensive research into these cases was conducted by Dr. Ian Stevenson, a psychiatrist at the University of Virginia, who spent over 40 years investigating claims of past life memories. Between 1960 and his death in 2007, Stevenson documented over 2,500 cases of children who appeared to remember previous lives. He published his findings in peer-reviewed academic journals and in detailed books that read more like detective case files than spiritual treatises. Stevenson didn't just collect stories. He investigated them. He traveled to remote villages. He interviewed families. He corroborated facts. He looked for every possible alternative explanation. And some of his cases are extraordinarily difficult to explain. Let me give you a few examples. Case 1, Shanti Devi, the case that started it all. Delhi, India, 1930. A 4-year-old girl named Shanti Devi began telling her parents about her other home. She described a house in a town called Mathura, about 90 miles away, a place she had never visited. She said her name had been Lugdi. She had been married to a man named Kedar Nath. She had died giving birth to her third child in 1925, just 1 year before Shanti was born. Her parents dismissed it as childhood imagination, but Shanti wouldn't stop talking about it. She described the house in vivid detail. She mentioned relatives by name. She spoke about her husband's business, a cloth shop in Mathura. Finally, when Shanti was 9 years old, her parents decided to investigate. They sent a letter to the address Shanti had described in Mathura, addressed to Kedar Nath. A reply came back. Everything Shanti had said was true. There had been a woman named Lugdi. She had been married to Kedar Nath. She had died in childbirth in 1925. The house, the cloth shop, the relatives, all exactly as Shanti described. Kedar Nath traveled to Delhi to meet Shanti. When he arrived, Shanti, who had never seen this man before, recognized him immediately. She called him by name. She wept and asked about their children. Kedar Nath was shaken. He confirmed that Shanti knew intimate details about his late wife, things that even close friends wouldn't have known. The case attracted national attention. A committee of prominent citizens was formed to investigate. They took Shanti to Mathura without telling her where they were going. When the train pulled into the station, Shanti pointed out the platform where Lugdi had often waited for her husband. They took her to the neighborhood, and she navigated the streets without help, leading them to her old house. When she entered, she identified rooms, furniture, and hiding places. She pointed to a spot in the courtyard and said she had buried money there in her past life. They dug. They found the money. Kedar Nath confirmed that his late wife had hidden money in that exact spot, and no one else knew about it. The case was investigated by multiple committees, including one led by Mahatma Gandhi. The consensus: Shanti Devi appeared to have genuine memories of a life that ended before she was born. No one could explain how. Case 2, James Leininger, The World War. 2 Pilot. We opened with this case, but let's go deeper. James Leininger was born in 1998 in Louisiana. He was a normal toddler until, at age 2, he started having intense nightmares about plane crashes. But these weren't vague nightmares. James described specific details. He said his plane was a Corsair, a specific type of World War II fighter plane. He said it took off from a ship called the Natoma. He said he was shot down at Iwo Jima. He said his plane was hit in the engine and caught fire. He couldn't get out of the cockpit. His parents, Bruce and Andrea, were bewildered. James was 2 years old. They hadn't shown him war movies. They didn't talk about World War II. Where was this coming from? James started drawing pictures of air battles. His drawings showed planes with specific markings and details accurate to World War II aircraft. He mentioned names. He said he flew with a man named Jack Larson. His parents decided to investigate. They discovered the USS Natoma Bay was a real aircraft carrier in World War II. It participated in the Battle of Iwo Jima. On March 3, 1945, it lost one pilot, James Houston Jr. Houston's plane was shot down by Japanese fire at Iwo Jima. The plane was hit in the engine and crashed into the ocean. There was a pilot named Jack Larson who served on the Natoma Bay. James Leininger knew all of this at age 4. Bruce Leininger, a conservative Christian who didn't believe in reincarnation, was forced to reconsider. He tracked down veterans from the Natoma Bay. Every detail James provided checked out. When James was old enough to see photographs, he identified pictures of James Houston Jr. and said, "That's me." The case was investigated by multiple researchers and featured in documentaries. Skeptics proposed various explanations. Maybe James had somehow been exposed to World War II information without his parents knowing. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe his parents inadvertently fed him information. But the sheer volume and specificity of details James provided before any investigation took place has left many researchers baffled. Case 3. Ryan, the Hollywood extra. In 2009, a 5-year-old boy in Oklahoma named Ryan started having nightmares. But these weren't about war or death. They were about Hollywood. Ryan told his mother, Cindy, that he had lived before in Hollywood. He described a big white house, a life of luxury, dancing on Broadway, traveling the world. He said he had been in movies. He remembered specific details about directors, studios, and street addresses in Los Angeles. Cindy didn't know what to make of it. She checked out a book about Hollywood from the library, hoping to identify something. Ryan pointed to a photograph in the book, a black and white image from a 1932 film called Night After Night. He pointed to a man in the background. "That's me," he said. The problem? The man in the photograph wasn't identified. He wasn't one of the stars. He was an extra, a background actor, not even named in the film's credits. Cindy contacted Dr. Jim Tucker, who had taken over Ian Stevenson's research at the University of Virginia. Tucker investigated. It took extensive research, but Tucker's team eventually identified the man in the photograph, Marty Martin, a Hollywood extra and talent agent who died in 1964. Ryan had made 55 specific claims about his past life. When Tucker cross-referenced Ryan's statements with Marty Martin's life, 52 of them were accurate. Ryan said he had been married 5 times. Martin was married 5 times. Ryan said he had 2 sisters and danced on Broadway. Martin had 2 sisters and performed on Broadway. Ryan said he had lived at a specific address on North Roxbury Drive in Beverly Hills. That was Martin's address. The details went on and on. Ryan described Martin's daughter's name, his career trajectory, even the kind of car he drove. Remember, Martin was an uncredited extra. There were no biographies about him, no Wikipedia pages. His life details weren't publicly available. How did a 5-year-old in Oklahoma know any of this? Case 4. Gus Taylor, the grandfather, returns. In 2014, a young boy named Gus Taylor in Cincinnati started making strange statements. At age 18 months, barely able to form sentences, Gus told his parents, "When I was big, I was your daddy." His father, Ron Taylor, thought it was just childish confusion, but Gus kept saying it. And then he started adding details. Gus said that when he was his father's father, he had a sister who was turned into a fish by bad guys. Ron's father, also named Gus, had died 1 year before little Gus was born. And yes, Gus Sr. had a sister named Pam who had been murdered and dumped in the San Francisco Bay. The family had never discussed this with little Gus. It was a traumatic event they didn't talk about, especially not with a toddler. But Gus knew. He described the old Gus's life. He picked his grandfather's photograph out of a lineup of similar-looking men, saying, "That's me." Ron, a skeptic, started testing his son. He showed him photographs of his extended family, including people Gus had never met. The toddler correctly identified multiple relatives by name, including Ron's grandfather, Gus's great-grandfather. "We didn't even have pictures of these people displayed," Ron later said. "There's no way he could have known who they were." These are just 4 cases out of thousands. Dr. Jim Tucker, who continues this research today at the University of Virginia, has identified patterns across these cases. 1. Age. Most children who claim past life memories are between 2 and 6 years old. The memories typically fade by age 8. 2. Spontaneity. The children bring it up unprompted. Parents aren't usually asking or encouraging it. 3. Emotion. The children often show strong emotions tied to their claimed past life: fear, longing, anger, grief. 4. Specificity. They don't speak in vague generalities. They give names, dates, addresses, relationships. 5. Death memory. Many children describe how their previous self died, often violently. 6. Birthmarks. In some cases, children have birthmarks or birth defects that match wounds from the previous life. This last point is particularly striking. Stevenson documented cases where children had birthmarks corresponding to fatal injuries suffered by the deceased person they claimed to be. Bullet entry and exit wounds, surgical scars, birth defects matching trauma. In one case, a boy in Turkey had a birthmark on the right side of his head. He claimed to remember being shot. Stevenson traced the claim and found a man who had died from a shotgun blast to the right side of the head, matching the birthmark location precisely. Coincidence? Perhaps. But when this pattern appears again and again across hundreds of cases, it becomes harder to dismiss. Now, before we go further, let me be clear about what this evidence does and doesn't show. It shows that some children make specific, verifiable claims about people and events from before they were born. It does not prove that reincarnation is the only explanation. Could there be other explanations? Absolutely. And we'll examine them in part 2. But for now, we're building the case for reincarnation, and the children's cases are the strongest evidence believers have. But they're not the only evidence. There are also the phenomena. Children's cases are dramatic and specific, but most people who believe in reincarnation don't base their belief on documented case studies. They base it on personal experience, on strange feelings, uncanny moments, unexplainable connections. They point to phenomena that, they argue, are best explained by the idea that we've lived before. Let's examine these phenomena. What are they? How common are they? And could they really be memories bleeding through from past lives? Déjà vu. I've been here before. Nearly everyone has experienced it. You walk into a room you've never been in, and suddenly you're overwhelmed by the certainty that you've been there before. Not just that it looks familiar, that you've actually physically been in that exact space. Or you have a conversation, and mid-sentence, you're struck by the conviction that you've had this exact conversation before. Same words, same setting, same people. Déjà vu. The French term for already seen. Surveys suggest that about 70% of people experience déjà vu at least once in their lives, and it's even more common in young people. For reincarnation believers, déjà vu isn't a brain glitch. It's a memory, a fragment of a past life breaking through. They point to cases where people don't just feel they've been somewhere before. They actually navigate unfamiliar locations as if they know them intimately. There's the famous case of a British woman who visited Rome for the first time and found herself giving directions to a taxi driver. She led him through back streets she had never seen, knew shortcuts that weren't on any map, and identified buildings that had been demolished centuries ago, but that she somehow remembered. When archaeologists verified her descriptions against historical records, they found she was correct. Buildings she described had existed, exactly where she said they were, but had been destroyed in the 1600s. How did she know? Reincarnation, believers say. She had lived in Rome in a past life. Xenoglossy, speaking unknown languages. Perhaps even stranger are cases of xenoglossy, people speaking or understanding languages they've never studied. The most famous case involves a woman named Dolores J., who under hypnosis began speaking fluent Swedish, despite having never studied the language and having no Swedish ancestry. She didn't just say a few words. She held conversations. She used proper grammar, vocabulary, and even dialect specific to a particular region and time period in Sweden. Linguists who analyzed the recordings confirmed this was authentic 17th century Swedish, not modern Swedish. Old Swedish, the kind you'd only encounter in historical documents. How could someone with no knowledge of Swedish speak it fluently, with period-accurate vocabulary? Reincarnation proponents argue it's because she had lived in Sweden centuries ago, and the language was still embedded somewhere in her consciousness. Skeptics offer other explanations: cryptomnesia, forgotten exposure to the language, fabrication, or selective reporting. But cases like this continue to emerge. Phobias without cause. Phobias are intense, irrational fears. Most phobias develop from traumatic experiences or learned behaviors. But some people have phobias that seem to have no origin whatsoever. A child who has never been near water, never had a drowning scare, never even heard a scary story about drowning, but is terrified of water from infancy. A person who has never been in a fire, never been burned, never witnessed a fire, but has crippling pyrophobia. Reincarnation believers point to cases where these phobias align with past life memories. Remember James Leininger? His nightmares about plane crashes started at age 2, before he could have developed a fear of flying through experience. Other documented cases include a girl terrified of red vehicles who later claimed to have died in a red car accident in a past life, a boy with intense fear of uniformed men, who described being killed by soldiers in a previous life. A child afraid of specific foods, which turned out to be foods associated with their death in their claimed past life. The pattern repeats, an inexplicable fear, followed by a past life memory that explains it. Coincidence or evidence? Prodigies, old souls. Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart composed music at age 5. Blaise Pascal formulated original mathematics at age 12. Pablo Picasso painted at a master level as a teenager. Where does this kind of talent come from? Most people attribute it to genetics, neurological differences, or intense early training. But reincarnation believers ask, what if prodigies are simply people who've practiced their craft across multiple lifetimes? The old soul explanation. It would certainly explain why some children seem to have knowledge and abilities far beyond their years, not just technical skill, but deep understanding and intuition that typically comes only with decades of experience. Edgar Cayce, the famous sleeping prophet, claimed that Mozart had been a musician in many past lives. Beethoven, same thing. Their genius wasn't random genetic luck. It was accumulated mastery across incarnations. This is unfalsifiable, of course. You can't prove or disprove that someone's talent comes from past lives, but it's a compelling narrative, especially when you encounter a 5-year-old playing piano like a concert master, or a young child speaking with the wisdom of an elder. Inexplicable connections to places. Some people visit a location for the first time and feel an overwhelming sense of belonging, of homecoming, as if they've returned to a place they've always known. These aren't vague feelings. People report intense emotional reactions, tears, joy, grief, longing, when encountering specific locations. And sometimes, these feelings come with knowledge. A woman visits a remote village in Scotland and accurately describes a house that burned down decades before she was born, down to the wallpaper pattern in a specific room. A man visits a battlefield and points to a spot where he says, "I died," then later discovers that mass graves from a historical battle were excavated at that exact location. A child visits a foreign country and speaks about living there, describes specific streets and buildings, recognizes landmarks, and later, researchers confirm the details are accurate to a time period before the child was born. For believers, these connections are evidence of geographic memory, the soul remembering places from past lives. Recurring dreams and memories that don't belong. And then there are the dreams, vivid, recurring dreams of living in another time, another place, another life. Not fantastical dreams, not symbolic dreams, but dreams that feel like memories. People dream of historical events they haven't studied. They dream of dying in ways that correspond to historical deaths. They dream of specific details that turn out to be verifiable. Some people have memories while fully awake, intrusive thoughts or images of lives they never lived. A flash of walking through a medieval village, a sudden memory of dying in childbirth in another century, a visceral recollection of speaking a different language, wearing different clothes, being a different person. For those who experience this, it doesn't feel like imagination. It feels like remembering. So what are we to make of all this? The phenomena are real. People genuinely experience déjà vu, phobias without cause, strange connections to places, vivid dreams of other lives. The question is, are these experiences evidence of reincarnation, or are they something else entirely? Reincarnation believers say the simplest explanation is that these are fragments of past life memories breaking through, that consciousness is continuous, and sometimes the veil between lives becomes thin. But there's another perspective, one that says these phenomena can be entirely explained by neuroscience, psychology, and coincidence. We'll explore that perspective in part 2. But before we get there, we need to address one more piece of the puzzle. What about the evidence that reincarnation believers say has been systematically suppressed? Here's where things get controversial. Some reincarnation researchers claim that belief in reincarnation was deliberately suppressed in the Western world, particularly by the Christian Church. They argue that early Christians believed in reincarnation, but that this belief was erased from official doctrine by church authorities who found it theologically or politically inconvenient. Is there any truth to this? Or is it conspiracy theory? Let's look at the evidence. The early church and pre-existence. It's true that some early Christian thinkers entertained ideas that sound like reincarnation. Origen of Alexandria, one of the most influential Christian theologians of the 3rd century, wrote about the pre-existence of souls. He suggested that souls existed before birth and would continue to exist after death, potentially in different forms. Origen didn't explicitly teach reincarnation as Hindus or Buddhists understand it, but his ideas about pre-existence implied that souls could have multiple embodied experiences. This was controversial, and after Origen's death, many of his teachings were condemned. In 553 CE, the Second Council of Constantinople officially rejected the doctrine of pre-existence. For reincarnation believers, this is proof. The Church deliberately stamped out belief in reincarnation because it undermined church authority and the doctrine of salvation through Christ. But mainstream historians push back on this narrative. They point out that 1. The condemnation was specifically about pre-existence, not reincarnation per se. 2. Origen never taught reincarnation in the Hindu or Buddhist sense. 3. The vast majority of early Christian writings reject reincarnation explicitly. 4. The New Testament itself contains passages that seem incompatible with reincarnation. For instance, the book of Hebrews says, "People are destined to die once, and after that to face judgment." That's not ambiguous. One life, one death, one judgment. Still, the controversy persists. Why? The Gnostic texts. Part of the reason is the discovery of Gnostic Christian texts, alternative Christian scriptures that were suppressed by the early church. When the Gnostic Gospels were discovered in Nag Hammadi, Egypt in 1945, they revealed a very different version of early Christianity. Some Gnostic texts contain language about the soul's journey through multiple spheres or lifetimes. Reincarnation advocates point to these texts as proof that reincarnation was part of original Christianity and was only suppressed when the Church consolidated power. Critics respond that Gnosticism was always a minority sect and was rejected by mainstream Christianity from the very beginning, not because of political suppression, but because it was theologically incompatible with the gospel message. Who's right? Honestly, it depends on which historians you ask. There's no consensus. What we can say for certain is, some early Christian thinkers explored ideas about soul pre-existence. These ideas were eventually condemned by church councils. Mainstream Christianity has been opposed to reincarnation for at least 1,500 years. Whether this represents a suppression of true early Christian belief or the natural development of Orthodox theology, that's a question each person has to answer for themselves. Jesus and reincarnation. And then there are the biblical passages that some reincarnation believers interpret as evidence that Jesus himself taught reincarnation. The most cited example is the story of John the Baptist. In the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus says of John the Baptist, "And if you are willing to accept it, he is Elijah who was to come." Elijah was a prophet from the Old Testament who lived centuries earlier. Was Jesus saying that John the Baptist was literally Elijah reincarnated? Reincarnation believers say yes. Traditional Christians say no. They interpret this as John the Baptist coming in the spirit and power of Elijah, not as a literal reincarnation. Another cited passage. In the Gospel of John, Jesus and his disciples encounter a man blind from birth. The disciples ask, "Who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" Reincarnation believers point out, how could the man have sinned before he was born, unless he had lived a previous life? Traditional Christians respond that the disciples were asking a theological question, not expressing belief in reincarnation. Again, there's no definitive answer. The passages are open to interpretation. The modern controversy. In the modern era, the controversy has shifted. It's no longer primarily about whether early Christians believed in reincarnation. It's about whether reincarnation research is being suppressed by the scientific establishment. Researchers like Ian Stevenson faced significant professional skepticism. Despite publishing in peer-reviewed journals and conducting methodologically rigorous research, Stevenson was often dismissed by mainstream science. Why? Reincarnation advocates argue it's because the evidence threatens materialist assumptions about consciousness. If reincarnation is real, then consciousness isn't just a product of the brain. It's something that can exist independently and transfer between bodies. That's a revolutionary claim. It would overturn fundamental assumptions in neuroscience, philosophy, and medicine. Skeptics respond that Stevenson's work hasn't been suppressed. It's been evaluated and found wanting. They argue that his case studies, while interesting, don't meet the standard of proof required for such an extraordinary claim. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, as Carl Sagan famously said, and most scientists don't believe the evidence for reincarnation meets that standard. But the debate continues. Researchers at the University of Virginia continue to investigate cases. New cases continue to emerge. And the question remains open. Is reincarnation being unfairly dismissed, or is it being appropriately scrutinized? We'll examine the skeptical perspective in depth in Part 2. But for now, we've built the case for reincarnation as fully as we can. Let's take stock of what we've examined. We've looked at the history and prevalence of reincarnation beliefs across cultures and millennia. We've seen that billions of people structure their entire worldview around this concept. We've examined specific cases. Children like James Leininger, Shanti Devi, Ryan, and Gus Taylor. Children who made verifiable claims about lives that ended before they were born. We've explored the phenomena, déjà vu, xenoglossy, phobias without cause, prodigies, unexplainable connections to places and times. We've looked at the controversy, whether reincarnation beliefs were suppressed by religious institutions and whether modern research is being unfairly dismissed. If you take all of this at face value, the case for reincarnation seems compelling, perhaps even overwhelming. children knowing impossible details, birthmarks matching fatal wounds, languages spoken without study, memories that don't belong. How do you explain all of this without reincarnation? Here's the thing. Everything we've discussed so far is real. The cases are documented. The phenomena are experienced by millions. The research exists. But there's another side to this story. A side that's equally important, equally rigorous, and equally compelling. The skeptical side. Because here's what we haven't talked about yet. How memory works. How easily it can be distorted, implanted, or confabulated. How suggestion can create false certainty. How pattern-seeking brains can find connections that aren't there. How coincidence, properly understood, is far more common than we think. We haven't talked about the cases that didn't check out. The children who made claims that were investigated and found to be false. The researchers who found alternative explanations for seemingly impossible knowledge. We haven't talked about neuroscience, about what happens in the brain during déjà vu, about why children's memories are particularly unreliable, about why phobias can emerge without trauma. We haven't fully addressed the theological objections, why most Christians, Muslims, and Jews reject reincarnation, not out of ignorance, but for deeply reasoned theological and philosophical reasons. And we haven't talked about the implications. If reincarnation is true, what does it mean for justice? For morality? For the problem of suffering? If a child is born into poverty or abuse, are we to believe they're working off karma from a past life? Is that comforting or deeply troubling? These are the questions we'll tackle in Part 2. In Part 2, we're going to apply the same rigor to the case against reincarnation that we applied to the case for it. We'll examine how science explains the phenomena without invoking past lives. We'll look at famous cases that fell apart under scrutiny. We'll hear from skeptics, from neuroscientists, from psychologists who specialize in memory and suggestion. We'll address Christianity's objections head-on and explore why the doctrine of reincarnation is considered incompatible with core Christian teachings. And at the end, we'll try to reach a conclusion. Not a dogmatic one, not one that claims absolute certainty, but one that weighs the evidence fairly and honestly. Because the question of whether reincarnation is real isn't just academic, it's personal, it's profound. It touches on the deepest questions humans can ask. Who are we? Where do we come from? Where are we going? Is death the end? Or is it a doorway? These questions deserve serious answers. The children who claim to remember past lives are real. Their stories are documented. Their accuracy in some cases is undeniable. But accuracy doesn't equal proof. Correlation doesn't equal causation. And compelling stories, no matter how moving, aren't the same as scientific evidence. So in Part 2, we cross-examine the witnesses, we test the claims, we look for the cracks in the foundation, and we ask the hardest question of all. If these cases aren't evidence of reincarnation, then what are they evidence of? So, what do you think? We've presented the case for reincarnation, children with impossible knowledge, phenomena without easy explanations, evidence that has convinced billions of people across thousands of years. But here's the truth. For every compelling case, there's a counter-argument. For every mystery, there's a potential explanation. And some of those explanations are just as fascinating as reincarnation itself. In Part 2, we're going to dismantle everything we just built. We'll examine how memory can deceive us, how suggestion creates false certainty, and how the human brain manufactures meaning from coincidence. We'll look at cases that collapsed under investigation and hear from the scientists who say reincarnation isn't just unproven, it's impossible. If you want to see the other side of this story, and trust me, you do, make sure you're subscribed to Stellar Narratives with notifications on. Part 2 is coming, and it's going to challenge everything. Hit that like button if this made you think. And until next time, continue to be curious.